Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around we're doing another hidden gem video for Sunday or Monday depending on when you're living. I'm theming these hidden gem movies, so this one is 10 Australian movie hidden gems. There are going to be a lot more in the future. I'm going to have each week themed, so let's get started. This is a 1987 movie and it stars the wife of a very famous movie star, Deborah Lee Furness. And yes, her and Hugh Jackman have recently split, but I don't care because they both supported Trump. But in 1987 they weren't even married and hadn't even met. And at that stage, Deborah Lee Furness was a bit of a star here in Australia. And she made a movie with director Steve Jodrell called Shame, which is a kind of neo-Western, a neo-feminist Western.
This town has a secret. A dark, shameful, well-kept secret.
Where she plays a character called Asta Cadell, who's a lawyer. She's on her motorbike travelling around the wheat belt of Western Australia. And she has an accident and kind of limps into town on her bike. She needs to wait for some parts and stays with a family in a country town which is run as an oligarchy by a family who run the local slaughterhouse. And as Asta stays there, she realises that there's a lot of violence against women in this town. Girls are raped by the boys. It's covered up by the family who runs the place. All through the different parts of the society of this little town, there's incredible violence and exploitation of women. And so she goes up against it. She's quite a competent person herself. And it's a toxic environment. The boys of the town have a hobby of gang the women. And so the women live in fear in this little town. It's a hidden gem, neo-noir feminist Western, which doesn't give us a very pat ending. The ending has a result, but it's at a cost for some of the characters. It was remade in America, but it's a much watered down version of this one. Don't get it mixed up with the movie where Michael Fassbender gets his kid out, because this is definitely not that movie. It's a gutsy film, and particularly for the 1980s, it's a film that was kind of raw and rough and a little honest. So it got a very good critical acclaim and some acclaim with some audiences, but it didn't get a very wide release, which is a bit of a shame. It was put out by Umbrella, who put out a lot of good Australian product. It doesn't need to be upgraded to Blu-ray or anything like that. The original source material, I think it was shot either on 16 or 35mm film, so upgrading it's not going to give you any advantage. If you're in the mood for not exactly a female version of Death Wish, a kind of enforcing the rule of law thing, it has more in common with Bad Day at Black Rock than it does with the Death Wish kind of revenge thing. Shame is what I recommend. You should watch it, but just be aware that the main star of the movie has in recent years become a worse person. Something lighter. Sex comedies have kind of gone by the wayside a little bit in recent years. There was always that male gaze, thirst trap aspect to them, but this one was the original Australian sexploitation movie. Apart from the kind of Mondo documentary things like Love and Sex Australian style. But this one stars Graham Blundell, and it's Alvin Purple, where Graham Blundell plays a character called Alvin Purple, who has the kind of superpower you want when you're 17, but you can start seeing problems with as you get older. He's basically irresistible to heterosexual women. This causes him problems from puberty. The schoolgirls all want him. The wife of one of his teachers has an affair with him, which is again one of those things which is kind of a little bit off from a modern viewpoint. But as he matures into adulthood, he gets a job with a psychiatrist who's running a sex therapy business with Alvin as the focus, and it's aimed at women who are having problems on the mattress. Of course, you get a lot of female nudity in it. You get, to be fair, you do get full frontal nudity from Graham Blundell as well, who later went on to become a great movie reviewer as well as anything else. It's Alvin Purple, directed by Tim Burstall, who also did a lot of serious movies in Australia, is a bit of fun. You see him getting chased by irate husbands, and there's a car chase through a drive-in movie theatre and across paddocks, and he gets chased onto an aeroplane and ends up parachuting into the Yarra River in the middle of Melbourne, and then finding that all the wives are together and he's getting chased by the wives and almost stripped naked in the middle of Melbourne. It's a silly movie, and it's got a very good soundtrack written and performed by Brian Cadd, an Australian rock musician of the time, who's still around, I think. But Alvin Purple was quite a cool celeb at the time it came out. It does have its kind of cringy aspects, but it still has a lot of fun to it. This version, which is from Roadshow, also has a sequel, Alvin Rides Again, which you should not see. It's not very good. It's not great at all. It is rubbish. Not worth the time you spend watching it. There is also another sequel made in the 1980s called Melvin, Son of Alvin, where an actor called Jerry Sant plays the son of Alvin Purple, who has inherited his special gifts and doesn't want them. Graham Blardell turns up as Alvin again, but even that's not worth watching. Only the original one's worth watching if you're interested in a good sex comedy, which has some interesting actors, and Jackie Weaver's in it as well. You might remember her from Animal Kingdom, and other actresses who've gone on to do much better things since. I kind of have a vulgar love for it, and it's a bit of fun. The next one was directed by Charles Chauvel, who was kind of like the Cecil B. DeMille of Australian cinema in the early mid-20th century. It stars Michael Pate, John O'Malley, John Hewitt, and Wendy Gibbs, and it's a movie called Sons of Matthew, which is about a family going up into the hills of southeastern Queensland and forming a dynasty. They're timber cutters, and they're building a home for themselves on Indigenous land, but Indigenous people don't play into this movie at all. And it's a story of their struggles and their loves and building a life in a quite a hostile to them environment. It's very much of its time in some ways, and it runs 104 minutes. It's in black and white, so it's not a short film, but neither is it a long film. Filmed up in the Lamington Plateau. Some spectacular photography of the landscapes there. In a modern context, I'm always reminded that this is a movie about colonisation and about taking the land that belonged to other people before them. Though that's not part of this narrative, though the second movie I'm going to talk about, which is directed by Chauvel, has a slightly more complex view of that. It's got some fine Australian actors, and it shows that Australia could do epic pastoral movies, at least as well as the Americans could. Didn't have the equipment necessarily that America had at the time for making these kind of films, but the storytelling, the acting, the direction was definitely there when Sons of Matthew was made. The other one I've got from Chauvel is from the mid-1950s, and it talks about issues that are still around today. It stars Nagala Kulnorth and Robert Tunawali, and it is Jedda, which is quite a complex story. It's a story of a baby who is adopted from an Indigenous tribe by the wife of somebody who owns a large homestead in the Northern Territory of Australia. He has Indigenous stockmen and other people around the house. Jedda is brought up, educated as a white person, though she is in fact Indigenous, and so she's kind of a person of two worlds. And she wants to go and play with the other kids and learn the stuff about her tribe, but her stepmother wants her to be a young lady, and so she's kind of conflicted with those things. Meanwhile, a renegade black person, by which the movie means somebody who doesn't give in to white fellas, played by Robert Tunawali, his name is Marbuk, comes in, and there's an attraction between him and Jedda, and he kidnaps her and takes her away into the bush. And there's a hunt for her, and she's kind of caught between two worlds. She's attracted to Marbuk, and she's attracted to the life of her people, and yet she was raised to be something different. It has quite a complex telling of this story from a 1950s viewpoint. The fact that she was adopted by a white woman rather than living with her own people is the reason for the conflict, and is the reason for all of the problems in this. The acting is fantastic. Robert Tunawali was a terrific actor and very talented, but he had quite a tragic life. This movie is one that uses the landscapes of the Northern Territory wonderfully, but still it's an uncomfortable movie in the sense that it's a white person telling a story for First Nations people. But nobody else was doing anything close to this at the time. Respecting and treating black people as human beings wasn't a major theme in Australian cinema for many, many, many years after this or before this. It was never done before. It wasn't done for a long time afterwards. And Jedda, even though it is problematic from several aspects, is an important film which highlighted the gifts and the talents and the acting and the cinematic presence of black people more than other films ever did up to this point. And so it's a hidden gem, it's an important film, and it's beautifully shot in colour in parts of Australia which are still there now as they were at the time the movie was made. Really great film. There are extras that contextualise it as well. Let's have a look to see. There are extras there. And Umbrella, putting this out on Blu-ray, did the country a service as well, because this is part of my nation's cinema history, and it's part of a discussion we've been having about First Nations, and are still having. In fact, we've got a referendum coming up about the recognition of First Nations in our Constitution, And it's a dirty fight against conservative forces who are lying, basically, and money is coming in from conservative American parties to finance advertising campaigns for the No campaign about Indigenous recognition. It's a clusterfuck of a referendum at the moment, but this movie is part of that discussion dating way back to the 1950s. This is a little bit Mad Maxy, this one, but it's a one-woman fight for survival against man and machine, a movie called Fair Game, which stars Cassandra Delaney. The story is basically she's living by herself in the outback and gets terrorized by a bunch of men who don't have kind intentions toward her. Andrew Leslie was the director of photography on this one, and it's a movie that looks really good. It's a solid action film in the exploitation kind of genre and the Ozploitation genre. There's some great car stunts on here. There's some really gritty and nasty bits. It's a good solid, basically a good solid action exploitation film. There's some of the pictures on the back, and now and then watching this you go, that was rough. That's a rough movie, even though there's a little bit of the male gaze at times and there are some scenes of assaults. The woman prevails because she is so tough and determined. And so you've got that kind of weird intersection of feminism and standard exploitation movie tropes in this. But it's a movie you should really check out. I'm not sure whether this version is still available. It was put out by Beyond Films, but it is a rock-solid Ozploitation movie with some great rural action, some great stunts, and a real strong female character as the protagonist. You should check that one out. Next up, we've got one of my favourite Australian films, and unfortunately, they could only be found basically a transcribed videotape copy of it. It's in 1.33 to 1 aspect ratio. It's been cleaned up a lot, and it's a crime that the original film of this has been lost. It's a comedy, it's a political film, it's a satire on Queensland here in Australia in the 1980s, which at the time had a state premier called Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who was an unashamed and complete right-wing nutjob. The police were corrupt, the government was corrupt. In Queensland, they don't have two houses of parliament in the state parliament. They just have one. It's the only state in Australia that only has one, which means if after an election a government gets in, they rule the government. There's no House of Review. There's no House of Lords full of inbred idiots. There's no Senate. And so they could get away with a lot. And this movie satirises it, directed by Carl Schultz, written by Bob Ellis and Denny Lawrence. Goodbye Paradise, starring the wonderful Ray Barrett as Michael Stacey, an ex-deputy police commissioner who's writing an expose of corruption in Queensland at a time when there's a political movement to turn southeastern Queensland into a new state, the Gold Coast state. And so there are lots of protests. There are pro and con protests. There's a lot of money going behind the statehood for southeast Queensland so the wealthy people can exploit the mineral resources and basically then the offshore oil resources. And Stacey, who is an alcoholic, stumbles into a political conspiracy which is not just about statehood, but a coup d'etat in southeastern Queensland by a combination of American military people, the CIA, Australian right-wing people, the military, the Australian military, and a whole bunch of politicians who have this idea that we need to have a powerful small country in the middle of southeastern Queensland. It's a very funny film too, as Stacey stumbles through this conspiracy and helps to undo it. He is tracking down a friend's daughter who's gone missing, who's a teenager. He gets involved with military intelligence people and lots of old friends and foes. He has a girlfriend who runs a pub in Surfers Paradise, played by Robin Nevin, who is fantastic in this.
Some hundreds of years before tonight, by a coincidence that didn't surprise either her or me, I'd been almost engaged to Kate back when the world was young. Here she was again, lads, 2 whole marriages later, hers and mine, moving slowly closer to the center of my life. I knew she was there, but I drew back from going to her and putting my head in her bosom and crying like a baby. We old soldiers have some pride.
Now, it's got lots of good character actors in it. Kate Fitzpatrick turns up, Guy Dolman, Paul Chubb, Lex Marinos, Tex Morton. It's a wild and crazy ride of a movie, which basically guts the dangerous government that was part of Queensland in the 1980s. And I like this movie a lot. The dialogue is sharp and funny. Stacey has alcoholic blackouts, but he's a kind of true believer. He believes in democracy. He believes in Australia. He believes in the rule of law. And yet he's surrounded by these malevolent forces who are trying to change the political landscape of Australia. It's a lovely film. It's hilariously funny in parts and very touching as well. And rightly so, Ray Barrett won a lot of local awards for his role in this film. And it's almost forgotten in Australian cinema. It's not one that's talked about because it wasn't the nostalgic colonial era picturesque movies that people were making at the time. It wasn't a Mad Max film. It wasn't a proto-Baz Luhrmann feel-good movie. It was a complex film and a lot of fun as well. And if you can find a copy of that, you can't go wrong. The next one's a movie by Rolf de Heer, who works in South Australia, in Adelaide in South Australia. And it's from 2003. It's a movie called Alexandra's Project, which is a simple story, but it's a hard story as well. In it, Gary Sweet plays a guy called Steve, who is a manager in a business that does security for housing. And he's got a wife and 2 kids. His wife's Alexandra. And there's tension in the marriage. She needs to use sleeping pills to sleep. He has a slightly skeezy relationship with his teenage daughter, where he's a little too huggy, and it looks like it's going to head in a bad direction in future. And he's a selfish guy, basically. He's all about his career and what he wants. He wants a wife and kids who are going to support him in his endeavours. It's a top-down kind of relationship. And so it's his birthday. He goes to work. He gets a promotion and a big bump in pay and a big bump in prestige. And then he comes home after that. The furniture's all pushed against the walls. And there's a video tape recorder, a television set, a video camera, and an armchair sitting in front of there. And he unwraps a present which says, "For you, Dad," and it's a videotape which has a birthday celebration from his kids on it for the first 5 minutes. The kids go away to be looked after by family, and Alexandra sits in front of the camera and starts talking to Steve. And she starts telling him everything she thinks is wrong with their marriage. And he fast forwards through that bit, which is like a 10-minute dialogue that he fast forwards through until a gun appears. And she starts messing with his mind enormously. With justification. She does things that undermine Steve's puffed up self-evaluation. She says things and does things that tear down Steve's image of himself, that kind of masculine, macho bullshit image he has of himself. The movie progresses in a really interesting way and tears down all the bullshit this guy tells himself about himself. Now, it's got some nudity in it, both male and female. Gary Sweet gets his kid off when he's exercising, and Helen Boudet playing Alexandra does as well. And a lot of the film is a guy sitting in front of a screen watching a videotape, and it's unforgettable. It's a harsh film. Rolf de Heer's done a whole bunch of different projects, including Ten Canoes, an Indigenous story told before colonisation. And this one is a kind of outlier, and he wanted to do almost a one-room movie, and he succeeds. There are scenes before and after Steve sitting in front of the video camera and the TV screen. But for the most part, the guts of the film is one man sitting in front of a screen and what's on the screen and what his reactions to it are. It's an incredibly memorable film, an incredibly harsh film. It didn't do well at the box office. It didn't do well with audiences. But when you watch it, you go, wow, that is something indeed. And Alexandra's Project, which there is a release on DVD by Umbrella. I'm not sure whether it's still in stock, but if it is, I'll post a link, is a real hidden gem of Australian cinema, which talks about things that don't get talked about enough and does it in a really different way. This next one's from 1948, and it's really hard to find a copy of. I found a VHS copy of it. I think it is on YouTube, but I found it by another means. And it's Chips Rafferty movie, which is almost an Australian Western from 1948 called The Phantom Stockman, where Chips Rafferty plays a supernatural stockman who has learned a whole bunch of stuff from Indigenous people, including some magic things. And he comes and helps a woman who is running her farm after her parents die. Some family members of hers and her neighbours want to take it away from her. And he helps her in various ways to defeat them. So it's basically a Western plot. But it's got some real features of interest. It's filmed in black and white, again in the Northern Territory. And it features one of the great artists of Indigenous Australia, a man called Alvin Purple, who had a lot of trouble with authorities here in Australia, and had a lot of trouble because he was an Indigenous man at a time when Indigenous people in this country couldn't even vote, let alone be counted as citizens. There was a referendum in 1967, which finally gave them full citizenship, but it's been a struggle since then. There was a struggle before then. And there were so many government restrictions on Indigenous people at the time that Mr. Namatjira had a lot of trouble with it. But the Phantom Stockman was kind of cool. It feels a little bit like a melodrama from the 1930s. There were a number of pastoral melodramas in Australia from the 30s. But I find it kind of interesting because it's almost like a superhero narrative embedded in an Australianised Western, well, which is kind of not fair because a lot of these kinds of pastoral stories were told in fictional form in Australia well before the Western was a thing. But the Phantom Stockman I kind of like because of its rarity and because it does feature Alvin Namatjira playing himself in a movie. Doesn't get a lot of dialogue and doesn't do a lot with it, but just the acknowledgement of him as a human being and as an artist and as a representative of his people was important. And I like the movie for that. I just wish movies like this had much better availability and that there was a decent copy of it that could be released and shown to the public and sold on physical media as well. The last one I have for you is an oddity because it's not an Australian movie. It's an Italian movie filmed in Australia about an Italian immigrant who came to Australia 25 years before and is looking for a wife. It's a movie called A Girl in Australia. That's the English title of it. And it stars Claudia Cardinale and Alberto Sordi, who was a comedic actor of the time. He'd been making comedy since the 1940s. This one is made in 1971, and he plays a guy called Amadeo, who's been living in a little town outside Broken Hill as a linesman. He fixes electrical and telegraph lines, and he's living in his little house. He goes into Broken Hill to the Italian club every week to go to a dance, but there aren't many Italian girls there, and the ones that are a little bit stuck up. And so with the aid of his local priest, he sends off for a mail order bride in Italy. There were a number of women in 1970s who did that apparently. And so he sends a photo of his friend, Giuseppe, who's much better looking than him, and pretends to be him. And so he corresponds with this girl whose name is Carmela, played by Claudia Cardinale. What Amadeo doesn't know is that Carmela is a sex worker in Rome, and she wants to get out. She's under the thumb of her pimp, and she keeps exchanging these letters for a little while, with Amadeo pretending to be his friend, until he sends her the money for a ticket, and she escapes with the aid of her friends from her pimp, travels to Australia, and they meet up. They go on a big journey because he's told her he has a big American car and what he really has is a rusty shitbox of a car, and they get lost going from Brisbane Airport to Broken Hill and end up in Cairns and do a bit of scenic stuff on the Gold Coast. And one of the other problems with Amadeo is he had malaria during the war, and he has kind of seizures at times as an after effect of having malaria. And he gets sick on the road trip back, and the only thing Carmela can do to help him is go back to sex work for a little while. And he doesn't know that she was a sex worker or that she's doing it to try to help him. Now, it's a complex story, and the characters, Alberto Sordi's comedy is not particularly Anglophone friendly, but the character grows on you after a while. He's kind of a innocent in a sense and a courteous man. The movie is beautifully shot. It's filmed in Broken Hill and in Sydney and in Queensland. And there's a weird scene where after Amadeo goes to the Italian social club, he's walking down some streets and a whole bunch of Australian sex workers kind of try to entice him. And it's pretty clear that they cut from a scene in Broken Hill to one that was filmed in inner city Sydney. It's a real outlier of a film, but it kind of grew on me, and I like the characters. And Claudia Cardinale, apart from being beautiful, gets to do some really decent acting in this film. And she is, as Carmela, is an interesting, complex character. A little bit like a better-looking version of Cabiria from Knights of Cabiria. Yeah, a complex story told about the immigrant experience to Australia, and I like it. I think it's a real hidden gem of a movie, which hasn't, I don't think, got a physical media release here in Australia, which is a bit of a shame, because I think there could be some legs in getting a physical media release by Umbrella or Imprint or somebody. It's a good story, complex story, and an honest story told about the immigrant experience to Australia by Italian filmmakers. And that one was a surprise to me. I've only just watched it. And I thought, I like this movie, and I didn't think I would. But A Girl in Australia, which has a longer Italian title, which I'll put up on the screen right now, is one that you should check out. It really does give a different viewpoint on immigration to Australia by non-English speaking migrants. It may be one of my top 10 or 15 discoveries for movies this year. So on that note, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and hit the notification bell. You can become a channel member, and there's a link in the description of the video on how to do that. You can also support the channel by donating at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. What have I got next? I may have a couple of really interesting new releases to review next time around. And then, of course, we get back to Science Fiction Saturday and more silliness there. And so until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some Australian movies that you haven't seen before and that have been totally off your radar. And I'll catch you next time.